This is us. I think most of you here know us. We do consulting, we do reports, we test systems to see if they really do what they are supposed to do, and we do entertainment. We do luncheons. And the agenda is this. We try to come up with a different set of topics every year and something that's pertinent to SIGGRAPH and to the industry. And so we contacted all of our, not all of our friends, but a lot of our friends for ideas for topics. And this is what we came, goddamn Outlook. Does anybody know how to kill this? It just keeps doing it. Anyway, so we came up with some topics that we think are pertinent, and I sent them around, or Robert sent them around to you guys, so you should have received email on this about what do you visualize in a virtual movie, and where's the rendering load going to be. We're probably going to skip over that because that takes us down a trail. I don't know if we have time to really spend too much time on it. The thing I'm most interested in is the CG actors. How long will real people be actors, and how do we make the models for all this? And we have an expert here who's going to give you some perhaps new points of view about how we capture things and create models for them. So, now this is a picture that Autodesk sent me. Is it coming out? Can you guys see that? This is a spectacular picture, and I don't know if we can get rights to this or not for you to reproduce in any article you want to read. But this is the entire pipeline, and the guy who put this together, Alex McDowell. He did an extraordinary job on this. This is one of those kind of graphics. You know, the graphics of the London Metro always gets congratulated for being so clever in using space and telling the whole story, and I think this does as well. And so if you can use this in any of your stories, go ahead. But check with Autodesk. I don't know who at Autodesk, but I guess Maurice. Check with Maurice at Autodesk and see if you can get this.
Yeah, we'll have to check
I can't hear you, Maurice.
But if you want to contact him.
So what Maurice said, if you really want to contact him. Didn't I just say that? So what do you visualize, or how do you visualize, on what do you visualize a virtual movie? And I want you to think about this before we get into the discussion. So are you lost, miss?
Yes.
So it's just stray people wandering in here. So who gets to do the visualization? And we are now moved into a new era, and tablets have done that for us. And so the question becomes, can you visualize, can you do dailies, can you do early stuff on a tablet even? Or do you have to have a workstation in a room, or do you have to have a theater, or do you have to have some specialized piece of equipment? And the answer is, and the experts who are going to be in the panel will talk about this in more detail, but the answer really is all the above. You're going to do all the above. And what's happened is we now have a new vehicle, which is this beautiful tablet, as added to our toolkit on how we can visualize things. It's not the final visualization, and it's probably not the kind of thing you want to do any editing or serious work on, but it's great for looking at stuff. And that's why some people call them media tablets. And then where are we going to do the rendering? And you know, it seems kind of like a given that we're going to do the rendering in the cloud, wherever the cloud is. Well, you know, the cloud, what's that? That's just the internet. That's no big deal, but it has this mystical name called the cloud. But basically what it means is it will have processes and processors sitting remote to us, or will we? Because there's the issue of security. One of the most controversial things in movie production is losing control of the product before you want to get it released. And piracy is a really, really big issue, and it's even easier with digital data. So how do we handle remote servers and rendering farms and maintain security? And like I said, I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get into that, because that could be a whole discussion all by itself. This is the one I really like. So when do we replace real live actors with CG? And look at some of these characters. You could say, well, we already have. Now the difference is that with the exception of Simone right there, all the others kind of are based on human characters. And we're doing that because we need to capture how humans move. There is software out there that does a very, very good job of replicating and procedurally modeling human movement. It's a company called Natural Motion you may have heard of. They do a really, really super job about it. But just the nuances of how we move and all the motions we have in our hands and fingers is really difficult to do in a procedural way, and so you get jerky things like this. And you've seen it if you've done any computer game playing, especially third-person shooters and things like that. They look okay, but they move awkwardly. And the ones that move really nice and smoothly are the ones that have been captured and modeled. However, I believe, and you're welcome to tear me apart on this, and so is the panel, I believe that we're rapidly approaching the point where we'll be able to do procedural modeling on all of the nuances of movement that we have. And I see this as being one of the elements of approaching the singularity. And I don't want to drive you crazy with my singularity stories, but anyway, we're getting to the point where we have enough processing power, and we're getting smarter and smarter about algorithms, that I think the day is well in view where there's going to be major story acting movies, not fuzzy animations where rabbits jump out of the screen at you, but real serious stories where the actors are all going to be CG. And then if you're going to do that, and everything's going to be simulated, how do you create the models for the simulation? And so we're fortunate enough to have Ping Fu with us here today, who does that for a living, and she can model literally anything from a tooth to a building, and then give you something that you can build a set from, either in a computer or physically. And so we're going to talk about that, I think, a lot. And I think it's now time for the panel. Panel? Do I have a panel? I got one. Come on, get up here. Okay, 3, 4. Yeah. See if you can do that, actually. See if you can sync yourselves up.
Picture. Oh, two good-looking people. I'm happy.
Hey, nice shirt color, man.
Thank you.
We blend in together.
Yeah, we're a green screen.
I like that.
Okay.
So, I'm going to kick off the questions, and I had to write them down because some of them are fairly tricky. But this is not my interview of these folks. This is your interview of these folks. So I'm just going to get it started until you get your mouths empty or your courage up, and then I want to hear from you guys asking them questions. And the first one I wanted to ask, since that was the last thing I spoke about, was how do we get more realistic 3D into our visual effect environments? And what the question means is we make movies that are simulated, but we always can tell they're simulated. When do we get past that point? So start with you, Brian.
Well, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the uncanny valley. It's the whole phenomenon that the closer we get to realism, the more difficult it is to convince folks to watch. There's like an inherent rejection of certain levels of quality that we haven't really been able to explain quite exactly yet as to why. But we are getting closer, and there are a lot more advances in that area. As far as for increasing model sophistication, there's a certain point in which, you can only add so many more polygons into a model before it really is unnecessary for the level of quality of what we're presenting for on a movie screen or something like that. But as far as, are you looking for more specific technologies to?
I ask the questions.
Okay.
I don't answer them.
Well, I'll pass it on as well.
Okay. Is that question one or where or both?
How can we?
How can we?
How
Okay.
can we get
How
more
can we?
realistic
Okay,
3D?
got it.
Which presumes that we don't already have realistic
Right.
3D.
So the first one is, of course, capture the reality, right? We've been able to do digital photography very well now, and really 3D is just XYZ RGB rather than XY RGB. And I think we are already at the inflection point that we can do that. But when you talk about reality, just replicating a static reality is insufficient, because motion is very important. Moreover, emotion is very important. So I think we are already there in capture the static reality. We're quite advanced in capture the motion of the reality. We're totally not there to capture the emotion of the reality.
That's good.
So, working in Dreamworks animation, we don't really focus too much on the photorealistic, more on the faux realistic. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there are no actual kung fu fighting pandas out there in the world today.
What?
Really?
I know,
No
it's
way.
hard to believe.
I can get you one.
You can get me one.
I'm leaving. I can't. It's ruined my day.
But one area that we do focus on photorealism is actually in our lighting and rendering process, because one of the things that you'll find is one of the things that make movies believable is not just motion, and because we're in DreamWorks animation, not DreamWorks motion capture, we still have do hand animation of all of our characters. But in terms of lighting, what we found is the more closer that we get to physicality and realistic lighting, that makes our movies far more believable. And so I think that's come through. That's coming to us through a couple of pieces. First is just raw processing power. You have that question at some point about rendering on the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
One question would be how big that cloud needs to get, right? Because it's certainly very large with us and our partners at HP. And then the other side of it is just the interactivity of the tool set, right? So not just the gross number of processors that you have, but how much you can apply towards what really is still a creative art form, right, of trying to mimic reality. I mean, even creating a film is not actually, a film lens doesn't work like your eye lens, and so it's really about still making art in order to make something that's a realistic film. Your turn.
My turn. I love that.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
You know, with Poser, one of the things that we've seen a lot is that our users create, remarkably so, photorealistic representations generally of the static human form. And it's done by a really brilliant combination of decent geometries, resolute textures, and lighting. And one of the observations that I have in terms of this problem of the uncanny valley is it seems that when I look out at the crowd, instantly, I don't even perceive that there's such a thing as depth of field. Everybody from the front row to the back row is kind of in focus. But when I look at you through a camera lens, I do have depth of field. And when I start recording, I get depth of field. And I have a sense that there may be a problem where we tend to think in terms of looking at a movie, in terms of looking at it as real life, and when we're looking at a 3D recreation of that, perhaps there's some sort of magical blend between how much depth of field we use or how much focus point we have. And I know that 3D can actually over-focus, and coming up with the right depth of field, we kind of come up with correlations on what that focal length of the lens is that we use. But I'm kind of at the sense where you can point your eyes in the correct direction so they're comfortable looking at a person that's looking at an image over a moving character that may be a little more challenging. But I'm wondering if there is something to do with how we actually, where that focal point is. And maybe that makes a difference. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Rob, what do you think?
Sure. You know, I think that really technology and all of the advancements we've seen over the last few years is to facilitate collaboration. In addition to that, it is to facilitate flexibility at the time of the event. So if you're shooting something, if you're doing stereoscopic, you want dynamic control of interocular. You want to be able to control dynamically the convergence point so that a director can set focus of the audience paying attention to a specific item or a specific character interactively. Because if you think about it, that's where the art form evolved from. Filmmaking is a collaborative and it is an inspirational thing that happens in the moment. So you discover things in the moment, and the problem is when we have so much technology, so much animation, so many things that have to happen that have centered on a post-production process for so long, which I wrote a white paper where I refer to it as the dark ages of visual effects, because it really took the process away from where we were making live action films, which was collaborative, interactive, and you had a lot of flexibility. You dial that lens, as you were talking about, you can make a change right in the moment of how that depth of field looks, and you see the full res, beautiful image in front of you. So I think the technology is really supporting. The biggest advancement is the way that it supports collaboration through all of the things we're discussing today, I think. And I think that is the biggest, and I would probably disagree with your comment about how it hasn't been able to capture emotion, because for me, a big moment was I know I worked on the film, but in Avatar, the two scenes that stood out was when Zoe's performance, when she confronted Sam Worthington about his betrayal, his character about the betrayal, and then when she was holding him in her arms and he was dying and the tear came. I thought for me, those two moments really did show her performance, and the emotion touched me so deeply. And I saw her performance on the set, and I saw that in the theaters, and I can tell you that it was the same performance. It was her performance that moved you. It was not anything digital or fake. It was
that question though.
Sure.
That was hand animated, right?
No, it wasn't.
The facial capture was hand animated.
No, the facial capture was captured in the moment from her.
You're saying I know they captured it on camera, but they actually hand animated that facial afterwards.
They also captured it with dots on her face as well, and that drove what you're talking about.
Okay.
So it was a different process than actually. I mean, we tried the process where you capture the data through motion capture. What they found is that the camera from multiple angles, and they had a system that would interpolate that information and drive. So the animators did not create that performance from its inception. It came from the capture of her face.
Right. It was excellent reference.
Yeah. Well,
Brian,
you can call it
one
reference,
day?
but
Well, all I would add simply is it's a lot easier for an audience to accept an 8 foot, 9 foot tall blue alien, and see it and say, "Wow, that looks really great." The emotion is there, but as soon as it becomes a normal looking or attempts to be a normal looking human being, it kind of falls apart.
Yes.
And that's the conundrum.
yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So would you make that a secondary definition of the uncanny valley? That if we leave the realm of fantasy and try to enter the realm of realism, that we break down again?
Definitely makes it more difficult. Absolutely.
Yeah, and viewers will automatically accept a more cartooned version of a human being. The more it tends to move towards ultimate realism, that's when we wind up having the breakdown, and that's where people start to reject and say, "I'm sorry, I know that he or she is supposed to look like a human, act like a human, emote like a human, but I don't buy it. For some reason, they still hit that
So
wall."
what would you say about something like The Curious Case of Benjamin Button?
Well,
What was the question? I didn't hear.
The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Where that
Uncanny.
well, there are a number of great examples. I mean, I just got done seeing the whole Rise of the Planet of the Apes too, and looking at Caesar and the apes that were used in that particular film, and they were beautiful. And I got past the believability issue and just enjoyed the film, and that was awesome. But I still, in the back of my head, said, "Fake." But I knew that because I work a lot in that industry.
Yeah,
so
it's hard for folks like us to get past that. I mean, we're probably the worst example of the uncanny valley.
Tron, which tried to make an old person young, is probably the best example of not making it.
Uncanny. Yeah.
I mean, you can see that it's not right, but you can't necessarily put your finger on how it's
People
not
should-
right.
That could have very well been intentional, though, because they were simulating something that was then inside a machine environment. I think Benjamin Button was a perfect example.
Neither of
Very quickly believed that this really was this character, wasn't a synthetic.
Well, there was some additional advantages there. It was merely, well, not merely, but a lot of it was face replacement, and you're not animating the entire body. It was only the face, so you did get that advantage of not having to worry about everything below the neck.
I think the other advantage you have is
where you've got technology getting too far advanced, where, in other words, if the image looks too pure, it goes back to depth of field. If the depth of field, we're so used to seeing visual images which are taken through a camera lens where we're seeing depth of field. And then when we start synthesizing this synthetically, where depth of field doesn't necessarily have to exist anymore, the realism gets to the point where you know innately that it is synthetic because it couldn't have been captured with a camera lens. So you walk this very fine balance.
Well, neither of them are really intentional because we actually involved in creating those statics of people face. The real problem is that even if you can make the face look exactly identical to a photograph that you see, but you can't put that emotion into the eyes. So like the Mona Lisa's mysterious smile, it's just really hard to make them live. You can make them one image look real, but you can't make them live yet. That's why I said the emotion part is extremely hard to replicate in digital. You can add stories, you can add voice, a storyline to invoke that, but we humans are so discriminating. We can see it. We can see that's not real.
Well, we're just starting to really get a mastery of the language, the unspoken language of emotion as well, and building up a set of representations for that. And then they're still dependent on an artist to recreate that. In some cases, artists are beautifully skillful at that. In a lot of cases, they aren't, and it's hard to drive
And
that.
I would just put forward, though, I mean, I disagreed with you on one level, but I really do agree with you ultimately, because I mean, I'm so strongly aligned with the fact that it is the actor's performance and a human that studied the craft of acting for years and has respect for that drove the performances that I responded to when I've seen performance captured. So there's a difference, the motion capture thing, but we've evolved into performance capture, which is really, I think, the path towards that. And the problem is the technology is just beginning to be able to capture the amount of data that we see. When you see little tiny muscles twitching and things that are just totally subconscious, to get to capture that amount of data, it's like when we were studying for many forests and images, and we went on little field trips to look at nature for the jungles of Pandora. You don't realize how many little tiny little fractal things that are there that have to be there for you to really buy that. And so it's just the magnitude of the data that is required to replicate, I think, is the issue. Yeah. But the concept of performance capture, that the technology does not replace an actor, the technology does not replace a cinematographer, the technology does not replace a director, it empowers them and allows them to do different things. The way that I see it, it was like digital makeup for Zoe and Sam, in a way. Because they can play, suddenly actors are freed because they can play any character, whereas before they would have been typed based on their physical body. And I think that's an amazing leap in the technology facilitating art.
Yeah, I agree with you. And if we actually achieve that, then we achieve singularity. We arrive at singularity.
Yeah, so we actually agree. Yeah, thanks.
If you look at the last night Electronic Theater, if you haven't seen it yet, they did a sequence from the Harry Potter film, where you're looking at they did the build, so they were showing the split screen, so you had the actor that was playing the elf, and then you had the synthetic elf, and the eyes were still maintained. So I mean, if the eyes are the gateway to the soul, the eye of the actor, where so much expression was coming from, was directly translated over to the synthetic character. And seeing it side by side in the Electronic Theater is a perfect example.
Mm. And it's also interesting to think about when the combination of high dynamic range sequence image capture, video capture, and the flexibility that would bring to digital manipulation after the fact, because you can think about that. There's so many things that you could capture, and then especially if it's from different angles, like when you were talking about the capture on the facial for Zoe was and Sam were just reference, but there's a difference between reference and if you capture that from multiple angles, the computer actually sees that as data and can interpolate data from that. So reference, it's roughly reference, but when you have so much data there that the computer has enough to create and recreate that in a 3D space, it becomes something more than just reference. It becomes a manipulatable asset, and it's flexible. I think that's the great thing.
John, weren't you, in asking the question, though, talking about going beyond performance-based to algorithmic-based?
It's a possibility. The point of the question was, and I think the panel's answered it excellently, given views that were not commonly known. The problem is that we do have this uncertainty or uncanniness, if you want to think about it like that, and can we ever get to the point where that is overcome? Excuse me. And I thought Ping's comments about, yeah, we can get a perfect reconstruction of the world, which we do for 3D modeling, for example, kind of all the time. But then what the panel started discussing on Ping's inciting question was, how do we bring the emotion of the capture that we're doing into the story and into the brain, if you will, of the viewer, that where they're going to accept it? And I think the answers are right there. I think that's exactly what we want to hear, which is a nice way to change the subject. So. The other topic that we want to try and cover whilst we're here is virtual movie making. And virtual movie making is, some people see it as a panacea. A lot of people see it as yet another set of problems that we have to solve, and they're just going to slow us down. And coming with virtual movie making is a confusion of terminology. I get confused about it, and so I want to start with Rob and ask him to give us his definitions of virtual movie making, and then just work on down the panel. And please take notes, because you're going to get a really big dictionary now.
You know, it's really a complex topic, actually, because, I mean, in its essence, what it is for me is what I said, that technology facilitates collaboration. If you look at all of the advancements that have happened, you know, with Avatar and with films prior, and the way that the technology has come together, it really is to facilitate collaboration between artisans on the film that have always been in place: the director, the cinematographer, the production designer, the art directors, all of these different departments, the previs group, and all these different departments. You would see in the past, oftentimes the structure was set up so that they didn't really communicate in many ways that would seem obvious that they should communicate, but because it had been set up a certain way, maybe the production designer was on the production for a certain time and went away, and then it became a different type of production. But what virtual production brought is kind of a sandbox, a centralized location, and that's what you saw in Alex McDowell's Mandela that was up, that image. It was basically a visualization of this centralized sandbox where everybody kind of communicates and crosses over and collaborates in a new way. And what that means for production, I can say what I observed on Avatar and when I worked on 1010, is that this increased form of communication facilitated by technology results in a better film, because the way that films were made with live action and the craft that has grown up over a century, and that these great directors understand and production designers and cinematographers understand lighting, was in place, but it was very interactive and collaborative in the moment, and they would make decisions and discover things on the set. If they walked into this room, they would take notice of this great chandelier, and they would make a change and maybe include an angle, or the light would hit somebody a certain way, or the way the tables were laid out would influence the performance, and if you walk down the aisle. If none of that is there, and you just try to create this based on storyboards or a concept of what it should be, it becomes a dead process that is created in post-production. Now, I've worked in post-production most of my life in animation, so that is not a negative comment. It is just realizing that filmmaking has not traditionally been that. Filmmaking has been a living process in the moment. And I think if you notice one thing about Avatar that made it unique, I think what I put my finger on is that the cameras that you experienced that film through were held by Jim Cameron's hand. They weren't done post-process after the fact by some animators or teams of animators that tried to interpret what James Cameron might do. He actually held that camera and shot the movie as he would a live-action film. When they were on set, there were things there that would feed the actor's performance, and there were suggestions that were made. There was one scene where Sam Worthington ran through, his character hit the anemones the first time the bioluminescent jungle was seen. I don't know if you've seen the film. That revealed something about his character, kind of an irreverence, a marine type, kind of boyish kind of thing that wasn't in the script. So that was something that Sam Worthington, in the moment, had that information in front of him. The set was there for them to experience. He had an idea, an inspiration, as an actor will, when they have props and things in front of them. He told the director, and the director liked it. And it was a scene in the film. Now, this happened thousands of times during that production. As a result, the final film was changed, and it was, in my opinion, much better than it would have been if it had been done a traditional way. And it was more alive. It had more of the human presence as we're trying to get through this technology available. So I think, for me, the collaborative element that facilitates this type of interaction and discovery through technology is what virtual movie making is.
That's interesting, Rob, but it's not what I asked.
Okay. All right.
So I want you to tell I want all the panel members to tell, and I ask you to start first. What is virtual movie making? When you talked about this guy having his moment of seeing the luminous forest, what was he looking at?
Well, he was looking at an environment that looked like what you saw in the final film.
How did it get there?
Well, there's a virtual camera, and you can immersively walk through the environment, which is displayed on panels all around the stage, much larger than that, and you see everywhere you're looking what you're doing. And as the character, he is no longer a human form, but he sees himself as a Navi on the screen moving through that environment. As he performs and as he speaks and does his action, he sees on the monitors around moving through an alien environment and himself as that character.
And the magic here is that this is now being done in real time with almost zero latency. So
Right.
it's, you know, if you did this and then later saw the image do that would be so disquieting you just couldn't stand it. And so this is one of the advances that we've made in technology in this industry, where we can have this, where you actually can replicate the movements and project synthetic background on it. And that's something we couldn't do 2 or 3 years ago, and it's going to change the way we make movies. And so we're still working out what's the vocabulary of this. So Steve, save me.
By the way, I want to thank you for that. I loved Avatar. It was a really wonderfully inspirational film. And I guess that's sort of what we kind of capitalize on.
A lot of great movie, not just me, a lot of great people.
Yeah. I'm surrounded by folks that make these amazing tools, and we make a great tool, but it's a really little tool in comparison to what you guys do. And I guess for us, what we've always taken the approach on in terms of whether it be imagery or video making, is that we wanted to focus on the end user being able to tell their story. We wanted to kind of make the tools as invisible and as seamless as possible so that they didn't get in the way of conveying whatever that story happened to be. Because ultimately, like when I get out with my iPhone and shoot video with my iPhone, I might be able to go into iMovie and produce something, and maybe it's something cool or clever. Maybe I did some stop frame animation that I want to share with my friends. But that's maybe the lowest rung of the virtual movie making spectrum, but yet it's still really, really valid. And I got to tell you, movies like Avatar, movies that you guys do, have really inspired who our users are. And they become everything from a 14-year-old kid that wants to get their feet wet in making digital content. They get inspired by something they've seen in-game video content or on-the-screen video content. And it's really inspiring to see the kind of empowerment that simple tools bring to the mix. So I can't address the real high-end stuff, although we kind of try and tie in with like folks with you guys we're going to plug in and all. But
it's great.
To be honest with you, you know, like what we like to focus on is making it as simple of a process to get from point A to point B being whatever that story is. And that to me is ultimately what the king is. You know, I just want to focus on getting that message out.
So Darin's going to have a completely different point of view on this.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to try and define virtual production because I'll leave it to the vendors and Newtek and Autodesk because they both
Yeah,
have,
but
I think,
you
really
live in
good
virtual
succinct-
production.
Yeah, well, what we do is actually we use a lot of the virtual production techniques to do more virtual pre-production because animated films have, even though they're films, they haven't been produced in the same filmmaking ways that you're talking about that have been done for years and years. However, one of the nice things, and we'll still do our animated films in the same process that we do. We're not motion capturing our actors, right? However, one of the nice things that the tool set that virtual production provides to us is to be able to do pre-visualization or virtual pre-production, right? Is to, rather than drawing storyboards, rather than doing rough layout, which is this process of gross animation and gross camera movement in order to get an idea of what's going on, we'll use these tools, we'll use these real-time tools in order to try and get some of the interactivity that you were talking about missing in post-production, getting that back into our process where it's never been there.
Yeah.
Right? You've never had an animation director sitting there and seeing Pohl and the Furious Five running around in front of him, in front of a virtual camera and moving that around and then reacting to that. Right? It's animation is a long, laborious process, and you have to plan that stuff out in advance. So the idea of having that collaboration, and in this case, our animators are our actors, so we'll actually take animators and other people, sometimes just PAs, and put them in mocap suits and have them go and rough out the scene so that we have those happy accidents that you're talking about. We get to have people try out different takes of different animation time and time again. And the thing that this process provides is because it's real time, you're able to do that much, much faster than you are when you're trying to produce the final product. So we get to essentially prototype what our movie is time and time again until we narrow that down to get closer to something that we're actually going to want to send into production.
Okay, so I'm in technology and I don't make movies. I do watch a lot of movies. For me, virtual movie making, I would say, not definition, but let's say what I'm fascinated about virtual movie making is about expanding the reality into something that is real but not possible with us. For example, multi-eyes, say we only have one pair of eyes, but virtual movie making can allow us to have 10 pairs of eyes to look at things from different angles. You see Tron where when the motorcycle flies, you actually see the motion of the motorcycle that trails the cycle. It looks very real for us because we all have seen things not fast moving, but actually our eye doesn't catch the image. But in the virtual movie making, it could capture that image that we have in our mental image, but in front of our eye. Those are possible in the virtual movie making. Some of the things that have been involved are in capture things that are too small for our eye to see, like at the cell level, molecules, or too large for us to comprehend, like galaxies. Maybe you've seen the Smithsonian movie on galaxy. So virtual movie making can extend our physical self and our mental self into things that we can't really see in reality, but we know it does exist.
I like that. That's good, Ping. Take us home, Brian.
Sure. Well, virtual filmmaking is going through a number of evolutionary stages. Before joining Autodesk, I used to work in pre-visualization on a number of films. And I've been doing previs for probably 10 plus years. And pre-visualization essentially is a planning tool. And it needs to be thought of as a planning tool in which we provide creative people in the pre-production process the ability to architecturally design their film, create an animated blueprint, so to speak, of what their film potentially could be. Virtual production, on the other hand, is an executable event. It moves from the planning stage and pre-production into the actual execution of using a virtual camera, a virtual environment on stage. And we like to sometimes think of virtual production as being where computer graphics are computer graphics on stage, or they're the equivalent of like an actor on stage. You actually have the opportunity to interact with digital elements of the film in production in real time, which is something the previs process doesn't necessarily provide. Again, previs is there for planning, virtual production is there for execution, and of course we're all familiar with post-production and how that all plays into the picture. So as technology increases and our ability to interface with these things becomes even faster and more efficient, directors will be able to walk into a volume. They already do now, but they'll be able to walk into a volume even more efficiently. Whether it's with, and we're talking about potentially new future technologies, whether it's just with a simple iPad and he enters into his volume and he can see and look around, but he'll be able to interface in real time with his digital actors, and
I would put forward that there may not be a volume.
There might not.
A volume is a construct of our limited technology. So.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
But I just want to add one more thing to this because it came up when some of you were speaking. I think we're the first generation, or among the first generation that grew up with the experience of such great science fiction films with Star Wars and 2001, all of that, at the same time that video game technology emerged. I'm not sure if this is a generational thing or not. I don't know if just the way we perceive it, but video games have been so successful for quite a while now, and sometimes they eclipse feature film releases, even though in our minds they don't seem like, well, it's not a blockbuster movie. I don't know if that's a generational thing. I don't know how long that will extend, but the exciting thing for me about this technology was really finally the emergence and of the combination of video game technology and all of that great innovation with filmmaking. That is really what has caused this kind of revolution to happen, is that the technologies have converged in a way that facilitates this. So I just wanted to add that.
The differentiation between game engines and the same kind of engine that they use in animations is there is no difference. So we're doing all the talking up here. How about some questions from you guys? I mean, how often do you get to hear these folks talk?
I just want to make a quick comment. Virtual filmmaking has been going on at the amateur level for the last 10 years.
Oh, you're going to have to elaborate.
Machinima.
Oh, okay.
The very first Quake was hacked by a gamer who managed to recreate the camera. And using multiplayer setup in Quake, the person who was the camera became the director. and they would speak in real time to the other actors and say, okay, you move over there when we do this, and you move over there, and then they scripted certain particles to occur, like explosions and things like that. That's been developing for about 10 years now, so that now you can go into the CryEngine 3, which is completely free, and create your entire film. And obviously, the talent level isn't as high as Pixar, but there's a lot of very interesting work being done in virtual filmmaking in that regard.
That's a really good point. That was what Robert made about two enables collaboration. He was talking about filmmakers to make collaboration. You'll talk about crowdsourcing. Yeah, that's a really good point.
That's a really good
Steve
point.
wants to provide those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one of the other things that's really neat about the machinima movement as well is that it's virally just like huge. I mean, there's some really, you can do funny stuff, you can do poignant, topical stuff, and it happens immediately. It
Well, one of the
can take a
great
day to
benefits
turn it
is that
around.
all of the materials that you need to make the film are within the game. And as long as it's not commercial, you don't have any problem with using any of that, because you're not making a profit
Right.
on it.
Right.
And if I borrow Autodesk term, it's really democratizing filmmaking.
Yes.
Indeed.
Okay. Well,
What about some of these other tools that are out there? So there's an interesting project called Alice Project, which has now spawned off a website where you can go and create a small film by literally just uploading dialogue and directions for the characters to move.
Right, or something like extra
Extra normal, yeah.
Right.
Classic.
Yeah, I mean, I think much like a game engine, or much like a game engine, one of the challenges there that you're typically limited to the assets that they have there. The game engines are actually built and completely optimized for the number of polys that you can have per character, the number of things that you can have lighting at one point in time, right? And so I think some of the tools and techniques that we're talking about here are really about not just pushing those barriers a bit and allowing those barriers to be changed on a shot-by-shot, scene-by-scene basis. But I think also, while you do have people interacting with the Quake engine or the Crytek engine, right? It's not like they're in a mocap suit and you're not actually capturing their physicality or their facial capture or anything like that.
But it doesn't make the story any less, or it doesn't make what the kind of person that's putting it together is trying to get across any less. I mean, it's not distributed through.
Story is still story, right?
Yeah,
And if you don't
yeah.
have a good story,
Yeah.
you don't have anything.
Yeah, and what you mentioned extra normal, and one of the things I love about extra normal is that tomorrow there could be somebody that does a SIGGRAPH in Vancouver versus a SIGGRAPH in LA argument that would propagate throughout our community. I mean, it's kind of it's wonderful to be able to kind of assign a topic and have that be instantaneously delivered.
Sure.
That's,
Well, I mean, look, that's what South Park is.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
They turn around those episodes in a week.
Exactly,
Or
exactly.
5 days, actually.
And when you first see it, you think like, oh my God, that's hideous animation. Yet, obviously, the content being irrelevant to the story that's being distributed.
It's like an organic filmmaking.
Well,
Game.
I think that's organic storytelling, but filmmaking actually involves cinematography, involves lighting
organic
choice, involves
storytelling
all
is
those
better
pieces to
word,
make
yeah.
something that's a beautiful piece of art, not something that's a topical.
Yeah.
Right, but we've all seen movies where the storytelling was terrible and it didn't make any difference how good the effects were.
Or how
It was
beautiful,
still a lousy
yeah.
movie.
Final Fantasy.
sure.
Final Fantasy is my favorite
yeah.
example of that.
Poor
Everybody's.
film.
Sadly.
Yeah. God, it really did look good, though.
Well, one
Horizon.
of the things that reality filmmaking
Yeah, it's
can offer is the ability to have happy accidents, which doesn't really work in a formal animation setting. You go in a sort of vertical process of creating the film as opposed to a lateral process where a mistake leads you to something new that you didn't realize
Right.
could have occurred.
Well, it is-
actually, I don't
sorry.
agree with that at all. I think it's
wouldn't
just a
agree with
matter
that
of.
either.
I think it's just a matter of the timing, right? Our animators, before we've had any pre-production, any real-time mocap feedback, they've done many takes of different approaches to a particular scene. Actually, we showed a couple on stage yesterday talking about Kung Fu Panda 2, which didn't have any mocap in it, right? So, you have an animator actually having to hand animate those different ideas rather than like happy accident of he just happened to go and touch a bunch of
But
an
many
enemy.
mistakes is not the same thing as an accident. Like he trips over the chair.
A discovery.
Walk there.
Yeah.
And suddenly the chair becomes this issue and it becomes a bit. And somebody creates the bit and the whole scene becomes
Well,
a
the
Sure, but
interesting.
we'll do that. I mean, before we had motion capture, we had a video camera, right? And actors would go into our acting room and set up things and do the exact same things. And you've seen some people do some pretty silly accidents there.
Plus the whole game engine issue is it's really good, and it's something that within pre-visualization we like to try and utilize when possible. I do know, though, that when working with individual directors in pre-planning and pre-production, game engine technology can sometimes be difficult to deal with because you sometimes have to fight the engine to accomplish what it is that you need. And directors are notorious for changing things, so they want to be able to have that ability to interact on demand with the people that are creating their pre-visualization. And if you extend that into production and in virtual production, that's what they want to carry over. They want to have the ability to have all of that interactivity, all of that on-demand response at their fingertips, and that just gets directors all tingly, you know. So
yeah, certainly nothing today meets that requirement. I mean, even we tried to make the best tool choices decisions that we could on Avatar, and I love Motion Builder for many things, but like it was a compromise because you could have a Crytek engine or you could have all these beautiful game engines, but yet you have the problem of translation, getting the data in there and back and forth, and that becomes a curmudgeon for production. And Motion Builder was kind of a trade-off because you had all the motion capture and the animation and the data manipulation tools and the cameras, but the display engine was so difficult to work with, exactly like you're talking about, because we had to cheat. And actually what we did is we baked in renders from a better render engine and onto the texture maps of the data that we loaded into Motion Builder to make it look great. And then the director was like, oh, that's beautiful. It's because we were using a real ray tracer engine to bake in beauty into the data to UV maps. It was a workaround. But you come up with creative solutions because the technology will never be perfect. It just facilitates, and you have to figure out better ways to work around what's available.
Randall.
Can I add a layer to this image? How is augmented reality going to affect this whole notion you're talking about of virtual movie making? And I see it in product development, which I cover more, where you're starting to get the idea, instead of having to create a visualization scene of the product and the scene, you just go get a real scene. You don't like that scene, you just go get another scene.
That's what previs is. Previs is basically augmented reality.
But the level of augmented reality, saying, for example, in Avatar, what if they had a set of cameras down in the rainforest in Brazil, and the image that was getting pumped back was both real stuff and the stuff that only could exist on Pandora? How is that going to add complexity or benefits to the virtual?
Well, certainly real-time motion tracking and compositing is going to be a growth area in the future. It's only the fact that the amount of data that has to flow and the accuracy levels at this moment in time, people are already trying that. There's already a couple of systems that have something in place that is sort of like that. Yeah. That's what we all want. We all really want what you just said in high dynamic range imagery.
Not only that, but it's...
And in stereo or more.
Yes. As technology continues to increase and cameras become more capable of capturing data that we don't normally associate with video cameras, that's going to change the picture too.
That's right.
I mean,
such as positional information.
Well, positional data.
And positional, there goes the volume. If you've got a camera that is locked into some Uber UPS, GPS system, you're basically anywhere you're at, you can find data and track that in real time on the camera and have it. It's really the way that it's going to go. And I think also, even flexibility with the actors' performances. And I don't want to all talk about performance like I don't love animation, because I love animation. I think it's an art form into itself. I just want to say that I'm not. But with actors' performances, having them in these strange uniforms, seeing Zoe or Sam Worthington walk in, or in this strange uniform that's alien to the actor, because clothing does affect your performance. You put on some sweats and an old T-shirt, and you're kind of going to walk different than if you dress nice. So I think in the future you also see advances in costuming that will weave in technology into the costumes that will be non-obtrusive to the actors' performances as well. Now, with animation, it's a totally different thing, because when we looked at Surf's Up, they were doing some great things because of the traditional animation workflow now involves 3D. Just because of the push for 3D, it now takes on a lot of live action characteristics just because of the nature of having 3D be part of the process with real cameras and real measurements. But seeing the actors the animators get to take that camera, the virtual camera, instead of animating a camera to pick it up and do their shot following the animated action with a real camera, brought a level of reality to the camera in an animated film in Surf's Up that wasn't there before, or wouldn't have been there without that technology, I think. So there's a combination.
Yeah, that's completely true. So we use virtual camera setups on all of our films, I think. I'm just going to lie about this number, but you can quote me on it. Like something like 97% of the shots in most of our films have some sort of...
Wow.
Yeah, maybe 98. Do I hear 98? 98. 98% of the shots in our films actually use a virtual camera of some way or another. Maybe it's just a pan, tilt, rotate head, but...
Because why not? You know, it's like it's a camera.
That level of realism, right? Because actually we all still remember film, right? I mean, I think one of the interesting things is what you're talking about with games. What happens when like my kids or my kids' kids or something don't really remember what film and film cameras and 24 frames per second felt like, and that's one of the things that we try and duplicate on the animated side or on the visual effects side, right?
Well, that's a good segue into the, I guess, last question we'll ask is, what about camera capture? And how do we even try to simulate overscanning and handheld look and out of focus blur and all the other things that we can do with real cameras, sometimes on purpose and sometimes not. Is that something we want to try and simulate also? Is that going to bring more realism to us?
I think it influences art. I mean, if you went to see Super 8, I loved the feel of that whole artistic choice, the production design, and that was, you know, facilitated the look and the color choices and the color correction of those images, and it just, why would you not keep it in the, you know, in the toolkit as an artistic choice?
What do you think, Brian?
Well, we did previs on Super 8, and one of the things that JJ wanted to accomplish was getting that sense of that documentary feel. But you don't want to underplay.
But did you do it in sim, or did you do it in real camera stuff?
Oh, well, we would use we would do some of it in our virtual cameras within previs.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, you know, one of the things I want to emphasize though is that we don't want to underplay the role of the cinematographer and other potentially, you know, very important people on set. And when we're creating pre-visualization, we have to understand that pre-visualization is a template, it's a guide, it's a blueprint. What happens and occurs on set shouldn't be shackled or handcuffed by the previs process. If the cinematographer wants to be able to expand on something that he's seeing in previs, or just to react to what's happening in the moment, he needs to be able to do that. So if that means he wants to introduce some form of a different way of handling the camera at that time, then he should be permitted to do so. And so we just have to be conscious of that.
Well, that's actually why I love some of these tools. So we're very fortunate to have Roger Deakins, hopefully you know who Roger Deakins is a world famous cinematographer consulting with us. And so having a tool, he doesn't really know Maya.
Yeah.
Right, but having a tool that feels like a physical camera. I mean, we have like a Steadicam set up and an over-the-shoulder rig and all that kind of stuff. Having those tools to be able to give to, here, you're a cinematographer, you show us what you'd want to do for this thing. That's
the craft has been built up by these people, and they know it. They know the art of it. A depth of field. I love still photography, and I have a lens I brought off of eBay that's a real hard-to-find lens from the 60s. It's a Japanese lens, and the depth of field in that thing is so beautiful. Totally not accurate to what reality would be or anything, but to have that artistic choice to make that be the look that I'm trying to portray, it may support the emotion of my scene or my film. And I think those are, sometimes having an ability to reduce the fidelity of your data is as important as having increased fidelity in the data as an artistic choice.
Well, it's a great, there's the company Lightcraft Tech, right? Where what they're doing is, besides some of the virtual camera stuff that we're doing, adding encoders so that they can actually capture the lens movement, capture the depth, essentially, and recreate the depth of field, so that you're not just seeing that on the actual photographed work that you're seeing, but also on the virtual work that's in the background.
So I want to extend this camera capture to 3D. We're still talking about cameras that project picture to a flat plan, but we are already at a point where we can take camera picture not projected to a flat plan, but get a pixel to go 3D. So you can use software algorithm to compute it so that you get XYZ RGB rather than XY RGB. And in that sense, that the augmented reality or reality, it blurs the line because your camera produces the data exactly as how your eye sees it, and it actually could produce data better than what your eye sees it because you can see things in much more detail or with artistical features.
That's great.
The best of the amateur work that we end up seeing all has cameras that are shaky. I mean, like, if you can implement some camera movement that doesn't look like it was on a static fixed point, it really
It's
adds
the human element.
believability to it.
The human element introduced back into anything through technology makes it feel better.
And again, I think that the amateur users that we encounter are inspired by the works that they see that you guys are doing. So, like, you know, it filters down. The art form becomes something that they see in a controlled environment and ends up becoming something that they implement on the street. It's kind of neat to see.
Absolutely.
Our moderator is left.
You talked about the feel and the emotion of characters, but there's also a feel of physical space. And sometimes I see that's a portion that's missing. You know, the feel of this room, for example, or feel of a smutty hotel room, you know, with the breeze coming through the window and the humidity and the mold and so forth. What can we do to start? Are there tools out there that are starting to be able to kind of immerse physical
Smell-o-vision, did somebody say?
I was going to say smell-o-vision?
Isn't there a new movie that just came out and they're actually on the trailer?
There's a
Yeah,
television.
Spy Kids. Right.
There's a television coming out that's going to have that chip in it that's able to produce that.
Nice.
That's big.
Well, that's a really good question, actually. In fact, that when the computation power become utility, say then computation is free, we could actually simulate not only what our eye can see, but also what our ear can hear and our senses, touch, smell, hear, and see, can all be simulated. We're not quite there yet. That's what makes the computing exciting. It's because that every time when we have a breakthrough in terms of computation power and cost ratio become linear, huge new things can happen. And we're really only at the beginning of that. And if we can do the buildings with the wind, the energy, then we can build a much more greener building. We can monitor all the energy that we're using. It goes far beyond filmmaking.
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily true also if whether or not we have to reproduce those particular extras. If we're really talking way out in the future, you know, I don't know how far, but it's the proverbial idea of jacking in and being able to have the computer directly stimulate the portions of the brain that recreate smells and sounds. And
I want a holodeck.
well, yeah, that's what everybody wants.
Do you think any of the developments in drone technology in the military might be affect some of this technology because you have virtual warriors essentially?
How's that for a handheld camera?
Yeah, going out and
You're asking the wrong panel. You're asking the wrong panel.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I've got 16 years in the military, so I could
Okay, so
potentially.
that's
You take it away. We're all artists, and we have no idea.
Well, you guys have seen the quad
Actually, it's
rotor
only
stuff,
12.
right? Have you guys seen all the iPad-driven quad rotors in
Yeah,
terms of
yeah.
that? I mean, they're a little four-rotor, very stable little device. People are putting everything from iPhone cameras and little small handheld video capture devices on those things,
yeah.
and then putting a link directly to the iPad, driving it, being able to put it outside the window here from, I don't know what the range
That's
is on
Chris
those things.
Anderson's company.
It's brilliant
Yeah.
stuff.
What the military is having right now with the drones is not the kill rate, it's the data rate. They are accumulating terabytes of data that they aren't processing. They don't have the time, they don't have the machines, they don't have the understanding. All of this stuff's getting accumulated, and it's just like the equivalent of sitting somewhere and doing nothing. Is that an issue already in movies, in this industry, or is it something you're looking at?
That's the editor floor, yeah.
Well, there's always the issue of archiving and the issue of what do you do with all this particular data. I mean, there's a number of films.
You make a director's cut.
Yeah, there's a number of films that have libraries upon libraries. I mean, if you were to like take the big like trilogy type movies, you know, the Star Wars series or the Spider-Man series or whatever, they have gigabytes upon gigabytes, terabytes upon terabytes of data that are sitting somewhere. Some of it's accessible. Some of it you would have to dig through in order to find certain things. We need a process or a methodology to help recall some of these older bits of data, so that we can use them again instead of having to recreate them each time and every time.
Do they reuse any of these virtual sets? I mean,
Sure they do.
sets
Oh, yeah.
that Studios build.
They reuse them in games also.
They
Quite
do
often,
sometimes, but not as much as they
It's
probably
amazing
should.
how many movies are set in New York City that are done by the same company that worked on Spider-Man.
And it was actually
Are you
photographed.
suggesting we establish the National Library of Movies and take all of this data, put it in
The Smithsonian of digital data. I mean, I think one of the biggest problems is so much data, not just from filmmaking and gaming and everything, but all of us. All of our documentation and everything is digital, and there's so much data.
Library as opposed to the Smithsonian is that this stuff is still alive and can be checked out, as opposed to just sort of sitting up there on the wall.
Well, obviously, though, too, there's intellectual property rights, too. You can't just say, hey, turn over all your data,
Well, but it's like a studio, leasing out their back lot. You can lease out
That's
the
true.
model of Pandora.
That is
One of
true.
the other problems that I think is happening too is that, like, in terms of if you counted the number of customers for like some of these models, these environmental models that are being built, I mean, like you guys represent 2, 3 here on the panel, but I bet that the number of customers, there's maybe 100 customers, I would imagine, if extrapolating beyond, of people that would maybe want to use those. If you start getting into an egalitarian approach and start looking at sort of the more fundamental levels, like the stuff that the amateurs that we interface with, there ends up becoming tens and tens of thousands of customers that want a Mediterranean village that's perfectly textured, that's beautiful, that's all lit, that's ready to go. Because when they're actually on the street and wanting to kind of create it at home, they need those assets. They need the same exact assets that were created for the movie. They want that level of resolution and quality and texturing, and they're willing to sit there and crunch 24 hours to render a single frame in full global illumination. They don't mind, because they're going to get some beautiful renderings when they're done. But in our world, it ends up becoming a revenue stream and a cottage industry for folks that have built all these brilliant sets and scenes and props and clothing items, et cetera, that work with a kind of a mutable environment, and then they resell them, and people in the outskirts of New York are buying houses because they're selling content to end users. It's kind of neat. It's a really big ecosystem that's growing around recycling and reusing these assets. Maybe that might be a neat way if you guys are licensing out, like Pandora, if I could go in and get the planet and bring it into an easily accessible virtual environment. Maybe that would be a neat way to kind of do a new revenue stream other than putting a Heineken can on the screen.
I think we want to be very careful about what we allow people to do with Shrek or.
Yeah. That's actually one of the problems that Disney, I think, has had in the case of like ever there being poser figures. They were worried what would happen to those.
Right.
Well, there was the issue with Lucas when the amateurs made a version of Star Wars and they
Yes.
used assets, and Lucas said, in one of his many moments of enlightenment, it's okay, go ahead and do it. Just don't mess with the image and don't sell it. And then, if you make $1 on it, then he's going to get pissed off. But up until then, play, have fun.
Well, your question is whether or not that's an issue when you have more and more data. I would say not. That's opportunity. That's the beauty of bits is the new atoms. If you have a bits, you put in the computer, when you add more, it doesn't add a mass. It's not junk. It doesn't fill your landfill. And technology is more and more efficient in creating more data. Of course, you need to create tools for cataloging, security, so on and so forth. But collect everything you can collect, just like we collect historical treasures. And the junk doesn't take much space. That's the beauty. And then if you go with atoms, new bits, which you can take those data and make something, you may make 0.1% of something out of this data. You don't know which one is the 0.1%. So I think more data, the better. Less junk is the better.
One of the challenges of that, though, is if you look at the evolution of our industry, the file formats have evolved so much just in 10 years. You project 20, 30 years in the future, we have not had standardization for intercommunication between the applications. And the applications themselves have been coming up with iterations of versions of software and scene files and object files and all of these things. We don't have a structure in place to archive and maintain that in a way that will make sense or be relevant in the future. I think it's going to come. The common language is going to come because it always usually does out of necessity. But there's so many wonderful things that have been done, models and scene files and great data that will probably be lost as the early silent films were, and that kind of an evolution of the process. For me, it's a tragedy. I think that there should be some replicate place to put like the first model of Babylon 5 from television visual effects and know how we can see that and experience. That's how it was in 1990. Ron Thornton did that, and
along with that, you have to have the definition of that model format so that you can reinterpret it at some later date down.
Well, right.
So
If you
model by itself,
right.
you have to keep
Right,
language.
and there's no mechanism in place for that.
But
There can be, but there's not.
There's a lot of great things that are happening with standards like Collada, for instance. I know a lot of us have tools that support Collada for
There's an announcement
interoperability.
about Alembic yesterday.
Yeah,
There was a big
right,
press release
right.
event just like this yesterday. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
And it's really intriguing to see. I mean, it's as a small developer, it's actually kind of hard for us to kind of keep track of it all because we have a variety of different interests that pull us in different directions. For instance, should we support Collada versus FBX? What's the most interoperable formats that we could kind of select with our limited development resources and then our limited schismed demands from different user bases? So it's a challenge, but we agree. I'd love to see like some kind of a big global adoption of a format.
Formats, yes.
That would be fantastic.
Absolutely. It's it facilitates the communication.
We've successfully run out of time, I'm happy to say.